The day Clara Whitmore got married, half the town came just to laugh. They didn't bother hiding it. Men leaned against the fence posts with their arms crossed and their mouths already curling. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their lips, not from sentiment, but to muffle the sounds they were making. Someone had written odds on a chalkboard outside the saloon. 3 months, maybe less. The groom was Colt Maddox, the most respected rancher in Red Hollow. The bride was Clara, heavy, quiet, and standing in a dress that hadn't quite fit right. Nobody expected this marriage to last. Nobody expected Clara to be anything at all. If this story caught your attention, stay with us until the end, and drop a like. Then leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. The morning of the wedding, Clara woke before the sun. She lay still in the narrow bed at the back of the Whitmore house, listening to the town come awake outside her window. The clop of horses on hard-packed dirt, the creak of shop shutters being propped open, the low rumble of men already gathering at Haskell's saloon, even though it wasn't yet 7 in the morning. She knew some of them were there on account of her. She'd heard the chalkboard odds from Lena Pruitt, who'd told her with the particular cruelty of someone who believed they were doing her a kindness. 3 months, maybe less, Lena had said. I thought you ought to know what they're saying. Clara had thanked her and gone back inside. She sat up now and looked at the dress hanging on the hook by the door. It was cream-colored, not white. Her mother had explained that white showed every crease and that cream was more practical. Clara suspected the truth was that cream cost less. The dress was fine enough. It was also a size smaller than what Clara actually wore, a fact she'd discovered 2 nights ago when she'd tried it on and stood in front of the small oval mirror in the corner, turning sideways, pressing her hands against her stomach the way she'd seen women do in the catalog illustrations. The dress would close, but only barely. The fabric would pull across her shoulders and hips in a way that anyone who looked would notice. She put it on anyway. Downstairs, her mother was already up, moving around the kitchen with that stiff, overworked efficiency that passed for affection in the Whitmore household. Her father sat at the table with his coffee and his newspaper, and he looked up when Clara came down the stairs, and his expression did something complicated. Not quite pride, not quite shame, somewhere in between that she'd been reading her whole life. You look fine, he said. Thank you, Papa. The Maddox boy is solid, he said, which was his way of saying this was a good arrangement and she shouldn't ruin it. The land rights that ran along the eastern edge of the Whitmore property had been entangled with the Maddox Ranch's water access for 11 years. Clara's father had been trying to settle it since before she was old enough to understand what it meant. The marriage solved the problem cleanly. Both families got what they needed. Her father had not said this directly to Clara, but she was 24 years old and not stupid. She drank half a cup of coffee, ate nothing, and walked the 3 blocks to the church alone. Red Hollow was the kind of town that looked better from a distance than it did up close. From the ridge east of town, it seemed almost promising. A cluster of buildings along a wide main street, the church steeple catching the morning light, smoke already rising from the smithy and the bakery. Up close, it was a harder picture. The storefronts were weathered, several still bearing scorched wood from a fire 6 years back that nobody had bothered to repair properly. The streets turned to mud when it rained and cracked open in the heat of summer. There were good people in Red Hollow. There were also a fair number of the other kind. Clara knew most of them by name. She had grown up here, had gone to school here, had watched the same faces age and harden over 2 decades. She knew who drank too much and who borrowed money they didn't intend to return. She knew which children were fed properly and which ones arrived at the schoolhouse in the same clothes 3 days running. She had spent 4 years helping her aunt run the dry goods store, which meant she knew almost everything about almost everyone in Red Hollow, because people talked in shops the way they talked nowhere else, freely, without thinking about it, as if the act of handing over coins made them temporarily invisible. None of that knowledge had made her popular. If anything, it had made her more of a target. She was not beautiful by the standards Red Hollow applied to women. She was wide through the hips and soft across the middle, with hands roughened from work and a face that was pleasant enough, but not the kind that stopped men in the street. She had good eyes, hazel, with a particular quality of attention that sometimes unnerved people, and her hair, when she took the time to pin it properly, was a dark auburn that suited her. But the town had decided what Clara Whitmore was when she was about 12 years old, and it had not revised its opinion since. The church was already half full when she arrived. She heard the murmur shift and thin as she came through the door, and she kept her chin level and her eyes forward. In the second pew on the left, Doris Hatch leaned toward her sister and said something behind her hand. Clara caught the tail end of it, that dress, and then the sister's responding smirk. In the back row, 3 men from the Cattle Association sat with their arms crossed, looking like they'd come to watch a prize fight. One of them, a broad-faced man named Aldrich, met her eyes without any expression at all, which was somehow worse than contempt. Clara walked the aisle. Colt Maddox was standing at the front of the church. She had seen him before, of course. Red Hollow was not a large place, but she had not spoken to him at any length. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that weather and hard work had carved into something angular and deliberate. Not handsome in a soft way. Weathered in a way that suited him. He wore a dark jacket that looked like it had been pressed for the occasion, and boots that had been cleaned but not polished. And when she came within a few feet of him, she noticed his hands, wide across the knuckles, scarred in the small particular ways that came from years of fence wire and rope work. He was watching her come down the aisle. She waited for his expression to do what expressions usually did. The almost imperceptible flicker of disappointment, the slight adjustment of the jaw that men did when they were recalibrating their expectations. She'd seen it many times. She'd gotten good at spotting it. It didn't happen. He just looked at her, steady and without performance, the way you looked at something you were trying to take the measure of. Then he gave a small nod. Not the bow of a man trying to charm her, just an acknowledgement. "You're here." "Good." She stepped up beside him. Behind her, she heard the church settle into an expectant quiet that had too much amusement in it. Reverend Dokes, who was 70 years old and had long since stopped caring about the emotional weather of his congregation, opened his book and began. The ceremony was short. There was no reading, no singing, no long passage from Scripture. Reverend Dokes moved through the words with the efficiency of a man who had said them so many times they had worn smooth. Clara listened to each phrase and made the appropriate responses, and beside her, Colt Maddox did the same. When the moment came to exchange rings, he produced a plain gold band from his jacket pocket, not elaborate, not apologetic, and slid it onto her finger with a steadiness that struck her. His hands didn't tremble. "Do you take this woman," Clara heard the pause before woman that Dokes may or may not have intended, "to be your lawful wedded wife?" "I do," Colt said. His voice was low and even. He didn't look at the congregation. When the Reverend pronounced them married, a sound moved through the church. Not applause, not quite. More like the sound of people who had come expecting one thing and found themselves uncertain. Clara turned, and together she and Colt Maddox walked back down the aisle. Outside, in the hard morning sun, someone near the saloon let out a whoop that was clearly meant to be mocking. A few people laughed. Clara kept her face neutral. Colt stopped walking. He turned toward the sound with a look that was not angry, exactly. It was the look of a man who had said his piece internally and was simply waiting for the world to stop being stupid. The laughter died down in pieces. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, then turned back and offered Clara his arm. "Ready?" he said. It was such an ordinary question, asked as if the answer mattered, as if the laughing crowd behind them was simply weather, unremarkable and already passing. She took his arm. "Yes," she said. The reception was held in the yard beside the church, under a pair of old elms that gave partial shade. There was food, nothing elaborate, cold ham and cornbread and a barrel of lemonade that someone had spiked before noon, and a fiddle player who'd set up near the fence and played with more enthusiasm than skill. Claire spent the first half hour of her own wedding reception largely alone. She stood near the food table and watched the town move around her. People who had known her for 20 years suddenly had difficulty finding her in a room. Mrs. Aldrich, who had bought flour from her twice a week for 3 years, passed within arm's length without making eye contact. 2 young women from the Methodist circle moved away when she stepped toward them. The movement casual and practiced, deniable. She ate a piece of cornbread and looked at the mountains. Colt appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of lemonade. He held one out to her. "This is spiked," she said, taking it. "I know." He looked out at the crowd. They do that at every reception. Haskell brings a flask regardless of whether anyone asks him to. He paused. You doing all right? I'm fine. You don't have to be fine if you're not. She looked at him sideways. I'm fine. He accepted this, drank his lemonade, and didn't push further. After a moment, he said, My ranch is about 11 miles out. North Road, then east at the split. It's not much to look at right now. Drought's been hard this year, but the house is solid. I'm not expecting much, she said, and then heard how that sounded. I mean, I know what you mean, he said, without any particular sensitivity about it, just a statement of fact. Neither am I. They stood there in a companionable, awkward silence that was better, Clara thought, than the noisy, insincere kind happening around them. Henry Walsh, who was a prosperous enough man to believe his opinion carried weight, drifted over with his thumbs hooked in his vest. He was one of the 3 men from the Cattle Association who'd sat in the back of the church with their arms crossed. Colt, he said. Interesting day. He glanced at Clara in the way people glanced at things they were not quite willing to look at directly. Here you've had a rough season out on the Maddox spread. We've had better, Colt said. Drought'll do that. Walsh rocked on his heels. Of course, some men find other ways to manage it. Cut their losses before things get worse. The silence that followed was the kind with a particular shape. Colt looked at Walsh with an expression that was utterly flat. This your reception, Henry? Walsh blinked. No? Then you'll want to find someone else's conversation to be in. He said it without raising his voice, the way you said something when you didn't need volume to carry it. Walsh's face moved through several things in quick succession and landed on a stiff smile. Just making talk, he said. You made it, Colt said. Now you can unmake it. Walsh drifted away. Clara kept her eyes forward for a moment, then said, You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't. I've been managing Henry Walsh for years. I'm sure you have. He finished his lemonade. But you shouldn't have to manage him at your own wedding. She didn't have a ready answer for that. She looked down at the ring on her finger, plain gold, warm from the sun, and found she was thinking about what managing meant and what it said about a person that their primary skill in social situations was endurance. The ranch was indeed about 11 miles out. They rode in Colt's wagon with what Clara had brought in 3 tied bundles in the back. Clothes, 2 books, her mother's cast-iron skillet that her mother had given her with the complicated expression of a woman who felt she was giving away something she'd earned and wasn't sure the recipient had. The road was rough, and the afternoon sun was dropping toward gold when they crested the last rise, and the Maddox spread opened out below them. It was bigger than she'd imagined. That was the first thing. The main house was a square 2-story structure of weathered timber, functional and without any decorative pretension. A barn stood to the southeast, its doors thrown open, and she could make out figures moving inside, ranch hands ending the day's work. Further out, she could see the pastures, brown dry from the drought, and beyond them the dark line of the creek that, by the look of it, was running considerably lower than it should have been in late summer. How bad is the water situation? She asked. He glanced at her. Bad. Creek's down to about 1/3 of normal. We've been rationing. And the cattle? Down from last year. Lost about 20 head over the summer to heat and poor grazing. His jaw moved. We're managing. Clara looked at the land and did some arithmetic she'd been doing since she'd first heard the details of this arrangement. Water rights, pasture acreage, head count, seasonal patterns. She didn't say any of it out loud. This was her first hour on the ranch, and she was not stupid enough to arrive with opinions. A man came out of this barn as they pulled up. Late 40s, sun-darkened, with a limp in his left leg that he'd clearly had long enough to have built a particular stride around it. He had the look of a man who'd been with the property for a long time and wasn't sure how he felt about today. Mrs. Maddox, Colt said. This is Decker. He runs the hands. Decker pulled his hat off. He looked at Clara with an expression she recognized, taking inventory, measuring, not yet willing to commit. Ma'am, he said. Mr. Decker, she said. The creek. Are you pulling from the upper or lower bend? He looked at her, then at Colt, then back at her. Upper. Upper's probably running slower. The lower bend collects from the north tributary. You might get another 1/3 of flow out of it if the north tributary's still running. She paused. I could be wrong. I'd want to see it first. Decker stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "We've been on Upper for 6 years." "I know," she said. "That might be part of the problem." She climbed down from the wagon and picked up 2 of her 3 bundles. After a moment, Colt picked up the third and led her toward the house. Inside, he showed her the kitchen first. Instinct, she thought, or perhaps something he'd been told to do. It was a large kitchen by working ranch standards, with a proper cast-iron stove and a good deal of counter space that had accumulated the particular clutter of a household run by a man who cooked when necessary and organized never. Dried herbs hanging above the window. Someone had started that habit and abandoned it. A box of accounting ledgers shoved under the table. Enough good ironware to stock 3 households, poorly organized. "I'll have Decker's wife show you the rest," Colt said. "She knows the place better than I do." "Does she live on the property?" "Decker's quarters are in the east wing of the barn. They're comfortable enough." He set her bundle down on the kitchen table. "Supper's usually whatever's left from the midday meal. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. I eat here." He seemed to hear how that sounded. "You're welcome to... it's your kitchen." "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Colt." "Colt." She looked around the kitchen with the focused, practical attention she gave most things. "This will be fine." He nodded, moved toward the door, stopped. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever they said about you in town," he seemed to be working out how to end the sentence. "I don't put stock in it." She had heard variations of this before, usually from people who had put considerable stock in it and wanted credit for pretending otherwise. From him it landed differently, without the performance of generosity. He said it the way you stated a position. "Here's where I stand. Now we both know it." "Thank you," she said. He left. She unpacked her skillet, hung it from the hook above the stove, and started looking through the pantry to see what there actually was to work with. The first week was nothing like the first week she'd imagined. She had expected hostility from the ranch hands, and she got it. Not overt, not noisy, but present in the way that mattered most, which was the steady, invisible kind. Jobs were done before she could weigh in on them. Questions that should have been directed to the household were taken to Decker instead. When she appeared at the barn to look at the cattle situation, the 2 youngest hands found reasons to be on the opposite side of the building. She didn't fight it. She watched. What she saw, over the course of 7 days, was a ranch that had been run with genuine competence and then slowly undermined by a problem that was not incompetence, but isolation. Colt knew cattle and land and fence lines. What he hadn't had, and what had been quietly compounding, was someone watching the edges of things, the supply purchases that were higher than they should have been, the trading terms with the Bauer General Store that had slipped disadvantageously over 3 years of handshake renewals, the grain storage that was losing more to spoilage than anyone had tallied because nobody had been asked to tally it. Clara tallied it. She found the ledgers under the kitchen table and spent 2 evenings with them, which was how she discovered that the ranch had been paying nearly a third more than market rate for salt and flour for the past 2 years. The result of a contract Colt had agreed to during a bad winter when he'd needed guaranteed supply and hadn't renegotiated since. She also found a pattern in the cattle losses that didn't quite match what drought alone would explain. Too many lost from the eastern pasture, in a particular sequence, on nights when the moon was dark. She said nothing about the cattle yet. She wasn't certain enough, and she understood that accusation without certainty was its own kind of damage. About the supplies, she went to Colt on the 6th day. He was at the fence line along the north pasture, working on a section that had come down in the wind. He was doing it himself because there was a fence to fix, and he was the nearest person to it, which was the kind of man he was. Clara had begun to map this about him, the way he simply moved toward problems without ceremony. He looked up when she came across the dry grass toward him. "Supply contracts," she said, and held out the ledger page she'd copied. "You're overpaying Bowers by 30%. He took the page, looked at it, said nothing for a moment. "I renegotiated with Bauer 3 years ago." "You renegotiated the delivery terms. The pricing formula didn't change. It's still indexed to the 1879 wholesale rate, which was high. Wholesale's come down since then." He looked at the numbers again. Then he looked at her. "How do you know the wholesale rate?" "I ran supply for my aunt's dry goods store for 4 years. I know what things cost." She paused. "You're not wrong about most of the ranch, but you've been letting small things add up." He handed the ledger page back to her. What do you want to do about it? I'd like to go into town and talk to Bauer. She said it carefully, because she was not asking for permission exactly, but she was also aware that this was his ranch and she had been on it for 6 days. If that's all right with you. He looked at her for a moment with that steady, measuring look she was getting to know. Can you drive the wagon yourself? Yes. Take the roan. She's easier on rough road. He picked up his fence tool. Bauer's going to be surprised to see you. Good, Clara said. Surprised people make bad negotiators. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the motion a smile sometimes left behind. He turned back to his fence. But she drove into Red Hollow the next morning. Edmund Bauer had run the general store for 15 years and had the disposition of a man who expected women to ask him questions rather than present him with answers. He was pleasant enough when she came through the door, with the particular pleasantness of someone who doesn't take you seriously and doesn't feel the need to hide it. Mrs. Maddox, he said, what can I help you with? Your contract with the Maddox Ranch, she said. She set the ledger page on the counter. I'd like to discuss the pricing structure. His pleasantness developed a slightly waxy quality. That contract was agreed to by Colt himself. I know, I have the original here. She had found it in a different ledger. She set that on the counter too. The pricing formula references the 1879 wholesale index. Current wholesale is lower. I'd like to adjust accordingly. The contract doesn't specify adjustment. The contract also doesn't specify that it can't be adjusted. Most businesses like to keep good long-term customers. She met his eyes. The Maddox Ranch spends about $400 a year here. That's not a figure you'd want to lose. Bauer studied the ledger page. He was not, she thought, a dishonest man. He'd let the terms ride because nobody had asked him to change them, which was a thing that happened in business all the time. The comfortable creep of favorable inertia. He was recalibrating now, doing his own arithmetic. I could come down about 8%, he said. The difference is closer to 30. She said it without heat. I'd take 15 and call it fair for both of us. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 12, 13, and you throw in delivery through winter. He laughed, genuinely, the short laugh of a man caught doing something he hadn't planned. Where'd you learn to trade? Dry goods store, she said. 13? 13, he said, and put out his hand. She shook it. On the way out, she passed Doris Hatch, who was coming in from the other direction. Doris stopped dead on the boardwalk and looked at Clara the way you looked at something that had moved unexpectedly, the automatic flinch of disrupted expectation. Clara, she said. Doris. Clara kept walking. Behind her, she heard Doris go into the store, and she could predict with absolute accuracy how that conversation would begin. She felt the familiar weight of it, the knowledge of what was being said, and she kept her feet moving on the boards and didn't look back. Some battles you fought because you had to. Some you simply left behind. She had a ranch to get back to, set. In the evenings, Colt sat on the porch. She had noticed this the first night. After supper, he would take his coffee outside and sit in the plain wooden chair on the left side of the door, looking out toward the pastures, sometimes reading, sometimes not. He didn't seem to need company, but he didn't seem to reject it either. On the 8th night, she brought her own coffee and sat in the chair on the right side of the door. They sat for a while without talking. The sky went from orange to pink to the blue dark that preceded proper dark, and the cattle in the near pasture settled into their evening quiet, and somewhere out toward the barn, a horse shifted and blew. The eastern pasture, she said finally. He looked at her. The losses. The pattern doesn't match drought. Drought losses scatter. What you've got in the eastern pasture is sequential, specific nights, always moonless. She held her coffee cup with both hands. Someone's moving cattle. The silence that followed had weight to it. I know, he said. She looked at him. I've suspected for 3 months, he said. I don't know who. Could be one of the hands. Could be someone coming in from the south. Could be an operation. He looked out at the darkening pasture. I don't have proof yet. What do you need? Evidence I can take to the sheriff. His jaw tightened. And before that, I need to know it's who I think it might be. Who do you think it might be? He was quiet for a moment. Silas Crow. She knew the name. Everyone in the valley knew the name. Silas Crow owned the biggest adjacent spread, had been acquiring land for 7 years, and had the particular hunger of a man who had stopped seeing land as something you worked and started seeing it as something you collected. "He wants this property," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's wanted it for 4 years." Colt drank his coffee. "When the arrangement with your father was announced, he came to see me, tried to make a counteroffer." "Did he?" "Offered to buy the water rights outright, cash." Colt set his cup down on the porch rail. "I told him no. He didn't take it well." Clara looked out at the eastern pasture, the dark bulk of it, the invisible cattle quiet somewhere in its depths. She thought about Silas Crow, whom she had seen exactly twice in her life, both times from a distance. A broad man, well-dressed for the frontier, with the particular quality of stillness that certain powerful men affected. The stillness of someone who had learned that patience was a better weapon than urgency. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Colt said. "He's not." She sat with that. The night came fully down around them, and the stars that appeared in this part of the territory came out in their particular extravagance, the kind of sky that city people came from great distances to see, though the people who lived under it daily had mostly stopped noticing. Clara noticed it. She had always noticed it. Growing up, when the weight of Red Hollow had gotten heaviest, she had sometimes walked to the edge of town in the dark and looked up, not for any particular comfort the sky could give, but for the simple fact of scale, the reminder that the opinions of a small town in a dry valley were not the size of everything. "I can help you document the losses," she said. "If we keep a proper night tally for the eastern pasture, we'll have something solid in a month." It'd mean someone up most nights. "I don't sleep much," she said, which was true. He looked at her for a long moment, and in the dark she couldn't quite read his expression. Then he said, "All right." He picked up his coffee cup. "Thank you, Clara." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We haven't caught anyone." She went inside. She washed the cups, checked the stove, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers again until the lamp oil ran low. And then she put out the light and sat for a while in the dark kitchen of this house that was hers now. In whatever way a house could be someone's, listening to the land outside settle into its night sounds. She was not happy exactly. She was not sure happiness was the right word for what she was working toward, but she was not what they'd said she was either. What? Not a joke, not a liability, not the punchline to a bet chalked on a saloon board. She was a woman at a kitchen table in the dark, doing the arithmetic of survival. It was not nothing. It was, she thought, a start. The tally book was a composition ledger she'd found in the kitchen drawer, mostly empty, and she'd started filling it the same night she and Colt had talked on the porch. Every evening, just before dark, she walked the fence line of the eastern pasture and counted. She developed a system, marks for each animal by section, notes on condition, a symbol she'd invented for anything that looked off. It was methodical work, the kind she was good at, and it gave her something useful to do with the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, when sleep didn't come and the ranch was quiet enough that her own thoughts got loud. Within 2 weeks, she had a pattern she could show on paper. The losses came in clusters. 3 nights running, then a gap of 10 or 11 days, then 3 more nights. Always moonless or near moonless. Always from the southeastern corner of the eastern pasture, which happened to share a half-mile of fence line with a property that Silas Crow had acquired 2 years back, a scrubby piece of land he'd never done anything visible with. She showed the tally book to Colt on a Tuesday morning while he was eating breakfast. He looked through the pages without speaking, which she'd learned was how he processed things, quietly, with his full attention, without the noise some men made to signal that they were thinking. When he finished, he set it down beside his plate. "Southeastern corner," he said. "Every time. That's Crow's fence line." "I know." He looked at the tally book another moment. "It's not enough for the sheriff." "Not yet." She refilled his coffee without being asked, a habit she'd developed that was practical rather than domestic. The pot was right there, and his cup was empty. "But it establishes the pattern. If we can catch the actual movement, even once, the pattern becomes context." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about Crow." She sat down across from him. "He came here," Colt said. "Week before the wedding. Not to the house. He stopped me on the north road. Said the arrangement I'd made was a mistake. Said if I was in financial trouble, there were better solutions than. He stopped, and something moved through his expression, something she might have called anger if it hadn't been so contained. He used particular language. About me, she said. About you. He met her eyes directly. I want you to know I didn't engage with it. I believe you. She did. What did he say exactly? He was quiet for a moment, the internal debate of a man deciding between protection and information. She waited. She'd gotten better at waiting with him. He wasn't stalling, he was genuinely thinking, and there was a difference. He said you were a liability, Colt finally said. Said tying myself to your family's property was a short-term play, and I'd have nothing to show for it in 2 years. He paused. Said some other things I won't repeat. I've heard most of them before, she said. That doesn't make them less of an insult. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She looked at the tally book on the table and thought about Silas Crow stopping a man on a road to discuss what kind of woman he was marrying, and she felt the particular cold clarity that came over her sometimes. Not anger, not exactly, but something harder. The recognition of an opponent who had already decided she was nothing, which meant he would underestimate her in ways that could be used. He's not going to back off, she said. And stealing cattle is slow. It's a pressure strategy. Drain you down until the ranch isn't sustainable, then come in with a purchase offer when you're desperate. Colt looked at her. That's been my read. So the question is what else he's planning. She picked up the tally book. Because patient men who are already running one strategy usually have another one behind it. The answer to that question came not from the eastern pasture, but from Hector Vale, who drove a supply wagon for 3 different ranches in the valley and knew things by virtue of being the kind of man nobody looked at twice. Hector stopped at the Maddox Ranch on a Thursday in the 3rd week of September, ostensibly to deliver the salt order Clara had negotiated with Bauer. He was a small man, somewhere around 50, with a narrow face and eyes that moved quickly and missed very little. He unloaded the salt and then, as Clara was signing the delivery slip, he said quietly, without looking up from the wagon bed, You ought to know there's talk at the Crow property. She kept her pen moving. What kind of talk? New hands coming in. 3 of them last week, 2 more this week. He stacked the last of the salt sacks. That's a lot of new hands for a spread that size, right before winter. She handed him the signed slip. Anything else? Crow had a meeting in Redfield 2 weeks ago with a man named Dunbar. Dunbar does title work. He folded the slip and pocketed it. That's all I know. That's quite a bit, she said. Hector climbed back to his wagon seat and gathered the reins. Mrs. Maddox, he said, and his eyes met hers for just a moment. People in this valley aren't all of one mind about how things have been going. Just so you know. He clicked to the horses and moved off down the road. She stood in the yard and watched the wagon until it was small in the distance, and then she went to find Colt. She found him in the barn, rehanging a door that had been warping off its hinges for what she gathered had been several months. He had the door propped against a sawhorse and was working at the hinge pins with focused, slightly frustrated attention, the way you worked at something that had been irritating you for longer than you'd admitted. Crow's hiring extra hands and meeting with a title attorney in Redfield, she said. He set down the hammer, turned. She told him what Hector had said. He listened with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face shifted through several things she was getting better at reading. First the analytical assessment, then something heavier behind it. Title attorney means he's looking at the land record, Colt said. The water rights, she said. The arrangement with my father. If he can find a legal weakness in how it was structured, then he challenges the marriage contract's validity as it pertains to the property. Colt's jaw was tight. The county recorder's office in Redfield. That's where the original filings are. We need to see them first. She said it calmly, though she felt anything but. Before Dunbar does, or at least as soon as possible. If there's a weakness in the filing, we need to know what it is. He looked at her for a long moment. You'd go to Redfield? Someone has to. She paused. Unless you have a reason I shouldn't. It's a 2-day ride. I know. He seemed to be working something out. I'll take you. Day after tomorrow. I need to square things here first. I can go alone, she said. I've ridden farther. I know you have. He picked up the hammer again, then set it back down. Emotion that wasn't indecision, but seemed like something needing somewhere to go. I'd rather go with you. She held his gaze a moment. All right, she said. Day after tomorrow. The trouble started the night before they planned to leave. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of raised voices near the bunkhouse. Not the normal sounds of men sleeping badly, but the specific pitch of an argument working its way towards something worse. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went out into the cold dark. Near the bunkhouse door, 2 of the ranch hands, Pete Gavin and a newer man named Rourke, who'd been on the property 3 weeks, had squared off in the yard with the terrible focused stillness of men right before someone swings. Decker was there, standing between them, his limp more pronounced in the cold. What's happening? Claire said. All 3 men looked at her. The moment shifted. Not resolved, but suspended. Decker said, Nothing that needs your attention, Mrs. Maddox. If it's happening in this yard at 2 in the morning, it needs someone's attention. She looked at Rourke, who had the cornered look of a man who'd been caught at something. What started this? Gavin answered instead, his voice tight. Found him going through the tack room, not for any reason that makes sense. The tack room, she said. Storage side. Gavin's eyes were still on Rourke. Where the supply records are kept. She looked at Rourke. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with hands that had done hard work, but eyes that were calculating something right now, running options. He said, I was looking for a blanket. Supply records aren't blankets, she said. Didn't find what I was looking for and left, that's all. She stood in the cold yard and looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, while not aggressively, but with a deliberate neutrality that was almost worse, the look of a man who had practiced looking innocent. Mr. Rourke, she said, pack your things. He blinked. Ma'am? Tonight. I'll have your wages ready within the hour. She kept her voice level. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you that someone going through the tack room storage at 2 in the morning isn't something I'm willing to explain away. And I'd rather be wrong about you and out your wages than right about you and not. The yard was very quiet. Rourke looked at Decker. Decker looked at his boots. The decision had been made and both men knew it. Yes, ma'am, Rourke said. Something went out of his posture. Not quite relief, not quite anything she had a name for. He packed and was gone before 3. She paid him from the household account, counted the bills twice, and watched him ride south down the main track without looking back. Back inside, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and wrote down what had happened in a separate notebook she'd started keeping for incidents, dates, times, observations. She wrote down the direction Rourke had ridden, south, toward Crow's Spread. She didn't write a conclusion. She wrote the fact, because facts were what held up, and conclusions were what people argued with. She closed the notebook and went back to bed, and lay awake until the sky began to lighten, which it did eventually, the way it always did, with or without her permission. They left for Redfield at first light. The road ran through country that opened up once you cleared Red Hollow's basin. Broader sky, longer distances, the scrub giving way in places to stands of juniper and low cedar. Colt drove without conversation for the first hour, which she didn't mind. She'd brought the relevant ledger pages and spent part of the ride rereading them, marking sections with a folded corner. Eventually he said, You sent Rourke off last night. Decker told you. This morning? Yes. He kept his eyes on the road. You didn't wake me. It was 2 in the morning, and it was handled. She folded the ledger page back flat. Would you have done something different? He thought about it, which she appreciated. Most men in her experience answered that kind of question immediately. No, he said. Same call. Maybe slower. Slower how? I'd have asked more questions first. He glanced at her sideways. You move fast. I move when I know enough. She watched a hawk work the thermals above a dry ridge to the east. I knew enough. What did you know? That he rode south. She paused. And that innocence looks different than what he was showing me. Innocent men get angry when you accuse them. Guilty men get careful. She'd been watching people's faces her whole life in the dry goods store, reading what was true underneath what they were presenting, and it had made her precise about certain things. Colt was quiet for a moment. You think Crow put him on the ranch? I think it's worth considering. which means Crow knows more about our operation than he should. Possibly. She closed the ledger pages and put them back in her bag. Or Rourke found nothing useful, and we got lucky catching him before he did. The wagon moved through the morning. The sky was the deep blue of September at altitude, and the air had the first cool edge of the coming season in it, a reminder that everything they were dealing with had a clock on it. Winter would narrow their options, stiffen the ground, make certain moves impossible and others unavoidable. She thought about Silas Crow sitting somewhere. She imagined a large, well-appointed room, because men like that always seemed to operate from large, well-appointed rooms, and planning his next move with the patience of someone who had played this game before and won it. She thought about what it meant to be underestimated by a man like that, and what you could do with it. "Colt," she said. When we get to Redfield, let me do the talking at the recorder's office." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because a woman asking questions about a property filing reads differently than a man asking the same questions. They'll be less guarded with me." She held his gaze. "And I know what I'm looking for." He thought about it for about 3 seconds. "All right. You're not going to argue?" "Should I?" She turned back to the road. "No," she said. "You shouldn't." She could hear in his silence the particular quality that meant he was amused, though he didn't show it in any way she could point to. It was becoming one of the things she'd cataloged about him, the ways that feeling moved through him without surfacing, the small, reliable signals of a man who'd lived a long time in his own company and had grown economical with his expressions. They made camp that night on a flat stretch of ground beside a shallow stream, and she cooked over the fire while he tended to the horses, and they ate without much ceremony. Salt pork and hard biscuits and dried apricots she'd packed that morning, and then sat by the dying fire in the high country dark. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." When Walsh said what he said at the reception, "And the others," he poked at the fire with a stick, sending a brief shower of sparks up. "How long does a person just absorb that? Before it stops being something you manage and starts being something that breaks you?" It was not the question she'd expected. She sat with it. "It depends on what else you have," she said finally. "If all you have is what they think of you, it breaks you fast. If you have work, real work, the kind that tells you something true about yourself, it's slower." She pulled her coat tighter. "I've had work. Most of my life I've had that. The store. And before that, figuring things out. Numbers, patterns, how things connect." She looked at the coals. "I'm not saying it doesn't cost anything. It does. But it doesn't break you if you have somewhere else to put yourself." He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was filing something. "And now?" he asked. "You have the ranch." "I have the ranch," she agreed. She left off the rest of it, that the ranch was also a test, that she was watched and measured every day by men who were waiting for her to reveal whatever inadequacy they'd already decided she had, that the morning she'd stood at the kitchen window and seen Decker talking to the 2 youngest hands, and all 3 of them had gone quiet. When she'd opened the back door was a moment she'd carried in her chest for 3 days before putting it down. She didn't say any of that, not because she couldn't, but because there was a time for certain things, and it wasn't sitting by a fire the night before a hard conversation at a county records office. "Thank you," he said, without specifying for what. She let it stand. The fire went down to coals, then to dark, and the stars came out in their full extravagance above the high desert, and she slept better than she had in weeks. The county recorder's office in Redfield was a low timber building beside the courthouse, staffed by a young man named Abbott, who was visibly surprised to see a woman walk in unaccompanied and ask to see original property filings by reference number. He was polite about his surprise, which was something. Colt had stayed with the horses, as agreed. Clara sat across from Abbott with the filing number she'd pulled from the Maddox ledgers and watched him retrieve the folder with the careful officiousness of someone who took his small authority seriously. The documents were 4 pages. She read them twice, slowly, with the particular attention she gave to anything that might have a hidden seam. She found it on page 3. A notation in the water rights transfer, a secondary clause that had been written in language slightly different from the rest, slightly more formal, slightly more carefully constructed, that created a conditional. The water rights attached to the Maddox property were guaranteed only as long as the property remained in continuous agricultural operation. If the operation ceased for more than one season, the rights reverted to the county, at which point they could be filed upon by adjacent property holders. Adjacent property holders. She sat very still for a moment. If the drought continued, if the cattle losses continued, if someone kept bleeding the ranch quietly until it couldn't sustain a full season of operation, the water rights wouldn't need to be purchased. They would simply revert, and Silas Crow, with his adjacent property, would be first in line to file. She thanked Abbott. She walked out into the Redfield street and found Colt at the hitching post and looked at him, and whatever was on her face made him straighten. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," she said, "but we know now." She told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a full 30 seconds, staring at some point in the middle distance with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not defeated, not panicked, but stripped, the way a man looked when he understood the precise shape of the problem bearing down on him. "He doesn't need to steal the land," Colt said. "He just needs to break the operation," she said. "One bad season is all it takes." He looked at her. "We're already in one." "I know," she said, "so we can't afford another mistake." The horses moved restlessly at the hitching post. Down the Redfield street, a clock above the land office read 10:30. She thought about the tally book at home, the supply ledgers, the southeastern fence line, Hector Vale's careful, quiet warning. She thought about Silas Crow's patience and what patience looked like when it finally ran out. "We go home," she said, "and we figure out how to make this season work." He untied the horses. "Yes," he said, "we do." They rode back from Redfield mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one on the way out. Tighter, working, the kind that meant both of them were thinking through the same problem from different angles without needing to narrate it. Clara spent the ride home doing arithmetic she didn't like the results of. The conditional clause in the water rights filing meant Crow didn't need to buy the land or steal it outright. He needed one thing, for the Maddox Ranch to fail to sustain a full season of agricultural operation. Given the drought, the cattle losses, the depleted creek, and the debt load she'd found layered through the ledgers like sediment, a bad winter could do it without Crow lifting another finger. The cattle theft was just acceleration. The planted hand was surveillance. The meeting with Dunbar, the title attorney, was Crow making sure he understood exactly when to move. It was a patient, layered plan, and she respected it in the cold way you respected something that was trying to destroy you. When they got back to the ranch, she sat at the kitchen table until past midnight making a list. Not of problems, she already knew the problems, but of what remained that was solid, what they actually had to work with. The herd, reduced but viable if losses stopped now. The new supply terms with Bauer, which would recover nearly $400 over the coming year. The Lower Creek Bend, which she still believed was running better than the upper, and which Decker had grudgingly agreed to test after her first week. The land itself, which was good land under the drought, she'd walked enough of it to see that. The water rights, which were currently valid and would stay that way as long as they kept the operation running through winter. And Colt, which was not nothing. She wrote that down and then felt slightly ridiculous and crossed it out. The Lower Creek Bend turned out to be running at nearly double the upper. Decker told her on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after they'd returned, and the telling of it cost him something visible. Not because he was a proud man exactly, but because he'd been running this ranch for 6 years, and a woman who'd been on the property for less than a month had seen something he hadn't. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands and said, "You were right about the Lower Bend," and then stood there waiting to see what she did with it. "That buys us something," she said. "If we shift the cattle rotation to the lower pastures and run a second channel from the bend, we can extend the grazing another month before they need supplemental feed." "Takes 2 men 2 days to run a channel," Decker said. "Can you spare them?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. "If I pull Gavin and Torres off the fence rotation, yes." "The southeastern fence?" He paused. "Other sections." "Leave the southeastern fence on rotation," she said. "Don't pull anyone from that." He understood why without her having to explain it. He put his hat back on. "I'll get Gavin started today." He was almost to the door when she said, "Decker." He stopped. "You've kept this place running through a hard stretch. I want you to know I see that." He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and went out. and she thought that was probably as much as either of them could manage by way of that conversation. October came in cold and hostile. 2 nights of early frost hit the northern pasture and took out what was left of the grass there, which pushed the cattle pressure onto the lower pastures where they'd just extended the water access. It was a trade Clara had anticipated but not wanted. They'd bought time, not a solution, and time was the thing Crow was also using. The cattle losses from the southeastern corner had stopped, or appeared to have stopped. She kept the tally book running and the numbers held, which meant either they'd spooked whoever had been moving the cattle by catching Rourke, or the operation had paused, or it had moved somewhere less visible. She wasn't certain which, and uncertainty was where she lived now most of the time. She was crossing the yard toward the barn one mid-morning when a rider came up the main track at a pace that wasn't casual. She stopped and watched him come. He pulled up in the yard and she recognized him, the younger of the 2 Hatch brothers, maybe 20 years old, who sometimes ran messages between the valley ranches. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, breathing hard. "Is Colt about?" "He's at the north fence. What is it?" The young man hesitated, and she could see him doing the calculation. Did he say it to her, or did he wait for the man? She held his gaze and waited, and he made the right choice. "Crow has filed a complaint with the county," he said, "over the water rights. My father heard it at the land office in Redfield this morning." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, a handwritten note from the elder Hatch, who apparently had better instincts about information than about wedding day behavior. "Says there's a question about the filing validity." She took the paper, read it, folded it again. "Thank you," she said. "You'll find Colt at the north fence, straight up the track past the barn, turn at the split oak." He turned his horse and went. She stood in the yard with the folded note and the wind coming off the northern ridge and the cold working through her coat, and she felt the pressure of it, the specific closing pressure of someone else's plan reaching its active phase. Crow hadn't waited for winter. He'd moved early, which meant either he was more confident than she'd assumed or something had happened that accelerated his timeline. The filing complaint wasn't a final move. County review took months. But it was a signal. It put the water rights in question on record, which would make buyers nervous and lenders skittish and neighbors cautious about the ranch's long-term stability. It was a move designed to isolate them. She went to write it in her notebook and then stopped, and instead went to find Hector Vale. Hector was making a supply run to the Beaumont Ranch, 6 miles east, and she caught him at the road junction before he got there. He pulled his wagon up and looked at her with the careful eyes of a man who understood the value of what he carried that wasn't cargo. "Crow filed a county complaint," she said. "I heard." "When?" "This morning, same as the Hatch boy." He adjusted the reins in his hands. "You want to know what else I heard?" "Yes. Crow brought in a surveyor last week, running lines along the eastern edge, near the corner where your fence meets his scrub property." He watched her face. "The same corner." "The southeastern corner, the same section where the cattle had been moving." She stood beside his wagon in the cold wind and let the pieces rearrange into the shape they'd been forming since September. The cattle theft wasn't just financial pressure. It was surveying. Someone walking that ground repeatedly in the dark, learning the fence lines, the soft spots, the drainage patterns. Someone building a case for a boundary dispute on top of the water rights complaint. Crow wasn't running one strategy. He was running 3 simultaneously, and each one made the others stronger. "Hector," she said, "if someone were going to find paper evidence of a planned boundary claim, not filed yet, just drafted, where would it be?" He thought about that carefully. Dunbar's office in Redfield is where the draft filings would sit, but Dunbar keeps his active work at a secondary office in Marble Creek. He paused. "That's just what I've been told." "Marble Creek," she said. "I wouldn't know anything about any of this," he said, "if anyone were to ask me." "No," she said. "You wouldn't." She stepped back from the wagon, and he moved on down the road, and she stood there until he was gone, and then walked back to the ranch with the cold at her back. Colt came home from the north fence in the late afternoon, and she was waiting at the kitchen table with the tally book, her notebook, the Redfield filing copy, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which was how she knew she'd been sitting there longer than she'd intended. She told him everything, all of it: Crow's county complaint, the surveyor on the eastern edge, Hector's information about Dunbar's secondary office. She put it in order, the way she put most things in order, because order was how you kept a situation from becoming a feeling. When she finished, Colt sat across from her and looked at the table between them. He had a particular quality in that moment that she recognized, not deflation, but weight. The weight of a man who had built something over a long time and was watching someone try to dismantle it methodically, and who was furious in a very deep and quiet way that was almost worse than the louder kind. "He's going to take everything," Colt said. "He's going to try," she said. "That's not me being optimistic, Clara. I'm telling you what I see." "I know what you see." She met his eyes. "I also know what he hasn't accounted for." "Which is what?" "That you have better records now than you did 3 months ago," she said. "Your supply contracts are documented. The tally book shows the loss pattern on the eastern fence. The lower creek access is established and mapped. None of that existed in July." She put her hand flat on the table, a grounding gesture. "He built his plan around a ranch that was losing ground and had no one watching the details. That's not the ranch you have now." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite gratitude, not quite something she had a name for. "You did that," he said. "We need to do more," she said, which was not a deflection but a fact. "We need to get to Marble Creek and see what Dunbar has drafted. If we know the shape of the boundary claim before he files it, we can get ahead of it. And if the county complaint goes forward, we answer it with documentation. The filing is conditional on operational continuity, but we demonstrate continuity. We have the records to do it." She picked up her cold coffee and then set it back down. "It's not certain. Nothing about this is certain. But it's not over either." He was quiet for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it working at the corners of the house the way wind did in October, testing the places where the caulk had gone dry. "I should have caught all this myself," he said. "You were running a cattle ranch through a drought," she said, "with a staffing problem and a cash problem and a water problem. You were managing what was in front of you." She paused. "That's not nothing. It's not enough either." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He almost smiled at that, the near smile she'd learned to read. "You don't soften things much." "Do you want me to?" "No," he said immediately. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man she had married 2 months ago in a dress that didn't quite fit, in front of a town that had come to watch her fail. He was not easy, was not warm in the way she'd seen other men perform warmth. He was direct and specific and slow to speak, and when he did speak, he meant it, and she found that she had come to count on that in a way that had happened without her exactly deciding it. "Marble Creek is a day's ride," she said. "I know. I can go alone." "I know that too." He pushed back from the table and stood. "But I'm going with you." They left before dawn. The road to Marble Creek ran through a narrow canyon that was beautiful in the way of places that didn't care whether you noticed. Red rock walls, a thin stream running along the canyon floor, stands of cottonwood that had gone yellow in the October cold. Clara noticed it. She noticed most things. Dunbar's secondary office in Marble Creek was above a feed store, accessible by an exterior staircase, with a sign that read Territorial Land Services in letters that had once been gold and were now mostly brown. The door was unlocked. The office was empty. Not abandoned. There were papers on the desk, a coat on the hook, a half-drunk cup of something that had been left there recently. Dunbar was out. The papers on the desk were face down, which meant nothing except that some people kept their papers face down. Colt stood at the door and kept watch on the staircase. Clara went to the filing shelf along the east wall, where folders were arranged by property name. She moved through them quickly. She had good hands for paper, always had, the habit of the store, the habit of the ledgers. She found it in the M section, behind a folder labeled Margrave, which had nothing to do with anything. Maddox Boundary Survey, draft, dated 2 weeks prior. She opened it and read fast. The draft filing claimed a boundary adjustment of approximately 40 acres along the southeastern corner, based on a surveying dispute about the original 1871 property line. The survey documentation attached was real, or looked real, the instruments and measurements of a professional job. The legal argument was built on a technicality in the original land grant language, the kind of technicality that required a specific counter-survey to refute. She didn't take the folder. She read it twice, and she was good enough with maps and measurements to hold the key numbers in her head. She put it back exactly where she'd found it, behind Margrave, in the same position. They were down the stairs and half a block away before anyone emerged from the feed store below. 40 acres, she said, walking beside him, matching his pace. The southeastern corner. He's claiming the original survey was off by 40 acres in his favor. Is it provable? It's a technicality argument. It needs a counter-survey to beat it. She thought fast. We need a surveyor before he files. If we have our own survey on record first, his argument becomes a dispute rather than a correction. Disputes take years in county court. Corrections take months. A surveyor costs money. Yes. She didn't say anything else about that because they both knew the state of the accounts, and saying it twice didn't help. He walked another 20 paces, thinking. There's a man in Red Hollow, Pearson. He did the original survey for the Beaumont Ranch 2 years back. His work holds up in county court. How soon can we get him out? I can ask him tomorrow. He looked at her sideways. You want to come? I want to check in with my father first, she said. The eastern boundary runs along the Whitmore property line. If Crow's claiming 40 acres on our side, he's also implicitly arguing about the line that your water rights are attached to. Colt stopped walking. She stopped beside him. Your father, he said. My father owns the adjacent land that made this arrangement possible, she said. If Crow is going after the boundary, he might also go after the Whitmore filing. Papa needs to know. She looked at Colt directly. And he needs to hear it from me, not from a letter or a rumor. He nodded once. Then we go to Red Hollow first. They turned toward the horses. The canyon walls caught the afternoon light and held it in a way that made the rock look briefly warmer than it was, and the cottonwoods threw their yellow light across the road, and she walked through it thinking about 40 acres and a man in a well-appointed room who had been patient for 4 years and had finally decided the moment was right. She had news for Silas Crow. The moment wasn't right, because she was in it now, and she was paying attention, and she did not intend to give him the satisfaction of winning something she'd spent 2 months learning how to protect. The horses were where they'd left them. She untied hers and mounted without waiting for help, which she'd always done and wasn't about to stop doing, and turned toward Red Hollow and the road home. Behind her, she heard Colt mount and follow, and the sound of the 2 horses on the canyon road was steady and purposeful, and it was enough. Bam! That night, camped on the road between Marble Creek and Red Hollow, the wind came up from the south, carrying something that wasn't right. She woke from a thin sleep and lay still and tried to identify it. Smoke. Not campfire smoke. Something larger and more urgent. She sat up. To the southeast, where the horizon should have been dark, there was a low orange glow. She was on her feet before she'd fully thought it through, crossing to where Colt slept and shaking his shoulder. He came awake fast, the way men did who had spent years sleeping on work sites. Southeast, she said. Look. He looked. For 3 seconds, neither of them spoke. The glow was not a structure fire. It was too wide, too low to the ground, moving in the way that only one thing moved. Wildfire, he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of something that changed everything. That's the valley. That's our valley. He was already moving toward the horses. She was right behind him. They rode through the night. The orange glow on the southeastern horizon grew as they moved toward it, and by the time they cleared the canyon mouth and the valley opened up below them, Clara could see the full shape of it, a wide front of fire moving northeast through the dry grass, pushed by the southern wind, eating the distance between the ridge and the valley floor with the particular speed that came from months of drought-killed fuel lying flat and waiting. The Maddox Ranch was in the fire's path. Not immediately. There was still a mile of open ground between the advancing front and the eastern pasture, but the wind was steady and the grass was bone dry, and she understood without needing to calculate it that they had maybe 3 hours before it reached the fence line. Colt rode faster than she'd seen him ride anything. She kept pace. They came in through the north gate at a gallop, and Colt was shouting for Decker before his horse fully stopped. Lights were already coming on in the bunkhouse. Someone had seen the glow from the south window, and the ranch was waking up in pieces, men coming out in various states of dress, voices overlapping. Decker came out of the barn with a lantern, assessed the southeastern sky in about 2 seconds, and said, How far? Mile, maybe less, Colt said. Wind's holding northeast. Cattle are in the lower pasture, all of them, We moved them 2 weeks ago. Decker was already doing the same arithmetic Clara was doing. Lower Pasture's got the creek on its north side. If we can hold the fire line at the eastern fence, we can't hold that fence with 5 men, Colt said. 6, Clara said. Both men looked at her. 6, she said again. What's the water situation in the channel we ran from the lower bend? Decker said, running good. We've got maybe 40 feet of pressure if we open the main valve. She was already thinking past him. The irrigation channel runs along the eastern edge before it branches. If we flood that channel to capacity and maintain it, it creates a wet line. Fire doesn't jump wet ground easily, especially if we widen it. She looked at Decker. How wide is the channel right now? 2 feet? Maybe 2.5? We need it 4 feet wide on the eastern stretch. At least. Decker stared at her. That's 2 hours of digging. Then we start now, she said. Colt, how far out is the southern ridge from the fire's current position? He'd been watching the glow while they talked. Fire's moving faster than I thought. Wind shifted slightly. It's pushing more east now. His voice was flat, the way it got when he was controlling something. Clara, we need to move the cattle first. If the eastern pasture goes, the cattle are already at the lower pasture, she said. Decker just said. The lower pasture fence has a gap on the southeastern corner. We found it last week, haven't repaired it. If the fire pushes that far, the herd will scatter through the gap. She processed that. Where's the nearest water break south of the lower pasture? The dry creek bed runs east-west about a quarter-mile south. Natural fire break, she said. It's been dry for 2 months. There's nothing wet about it. But there's nothing to burn in a creek bed either, she said. Rock and sand. If we drive the cattle to the south side of the creek bed before the fire reaches it, the fire jumps from the north and they're on clean ground. She looked at him. Does that work? Colt was quiet for 2 seconds, running it. It works if we get them there before the fire reaches the lower pasture fence. Then that's the first job. She turned to the gathered hands. There were 5 of them. Decker, Gavin, Torres, and 2 younger men whose names she was still learning, one of whom was maybe 18 and looking at the orange sky with an expression she recognized as the early stage of panic. Gavin, Torres, you're moving cattle with Colt. Get them through the lower pasture and across the dry creek bed. Move fast and don't stop for stragglers. She looked at the younger men. The rest of you are on the channel with Decker. Shovels from the barn, and I need the main valve opened on the irrigation line before anything else. Nobody moved for about 1.5 seconds, which was the time it took for the group of them to process the fact that she was the one giving orders. Then Decker said, "You heard her," and moved toward the barn, and the moment broke and everyone went. Colt was at her shoulder. "I need to be with the cattle drive." "I know. Go." He looked at her. "The fire moves faster than you think. If it reaches the channel before you've widened it." "I know," she said again. "Go, Colt." He held her gaze for 1 more second, and she could see him doing the particular calculation of a man deciding whether to argue and deciding not to. He turned and moved toward the pasture at a run. She went to the barn and got a shovel. The channel work was brutal. The ground along the eastern stretch had baked hard through the summer and softened only slightly in the weeks since they'd started running water through the irrigation line. Digging into it in the middle of the night with the smell of smoke thickening in the air and the orange glow brightening on the southern horizon was the kind of work that stripped away everything that wasn't immediate. No past, no future, just the shovel and the ground and the need to move faster. Decker worked beside her without comment, which she respected. The 2 young hands worked across from them, and she could hear one of them breathing too fast, the one who'd had the panicked expression. She paused long enough to say, "Slow your breathing, you'll last longer." And he looked at her and then did it, visibly, the deliberate effort of it, and after a minute he was steadier. Torres came back from the cattle drive at the 40-minute mark with a gash on his forearm from a fence wire in the dark, and the information that the herd had made it across the dry creek bed with most of the cattle accounted for. Colt and Gavin were staying south of the creek bed to manage the herd and would come back when they could. "How many did we lose?" Clara asked. "Maybe 8, 10 head, scattered south. Gavin's tracking them." She nodded and went back to digging. By the time the channel was widened to something close to 4 feet along the eastern stretch, the fire was close enough that she could hear it. A low, continuous sound she hadn't expected, less like roaring and more like 1,000 small things ending at once. The heat was real now, not just light, but temperature, pressing in from the southeast with the wind. Decker opened the main valve. The water came through sluggish at first, the way it always did when you asked a system to do more than it was built for. And she stood over the channel and willed it to move faster, which was not useful but was also unavoidable. Then it found its pressure and spread, filling the wider channel and running over the eastern edge and into the grass on either side, and the ground went dark with it. "It's not enough," Decker said. "It's what we have," she said. The fire reached the eastern fence line at what she estimated was 2:30 in the morning. She knew it because the fence posts at the far eastern edge began to glow orange, one by one, the wire singing in the heat. The grass on the far side of the fence was burning. The grass on their side was wet. It was not a comfortable margin. She stood at the channel with a soaked burlap sack, the ranch hand's method for beating out small crossings, effective only if you were fast, and watched the fire run along the fence line looking for a way through. It found two places where the wet line was thin and pushed embers across. She beat one out herself, swearing quietly at the heat. Decker got the other. The younger hand, the one who'd been breathing wrong, got a third crossing she hadn't seen, on the north end of the channel where the widening had been incomplete. He beat it out with his coat, which caught, and he dropped and stamped on, and then he looked at his ruined coat and looked at her, and she said, "Good," because it was. The fire ran along the eastern edge for 2 hours before the wind shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree or two of rotation, enough to push the front slightly more eastward, away from the ranch, toward the open scrubland south of Crow's former property. She felt it change before she fully understood what she was feeling, a subtle shift in the pressure of the heat on her face. Then Decker said, "Wind's moving," and she knew she'd read it right. By 4 in the morning, the fire front had passed. What it left behind on the far side of the eastern fence was a black, smoking landscape of burned grass and heat-warped wire. The fence posts standing in various states of charred survival, the air thick with the smell of it. The channel was still running. The ground on their side of it was dark and wet and intact. She sat down on the ground beside the channel because her legs had decided the emergency was over. Decker sat down next to her. He looked like she probably looked, smoke black, exhausted, burned across the knuckles in the small ways that came from work near fire. He looked at the eastern fence line, and then he looked at the channel. "This held," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've worked this land 6 years," he said. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood what it meant. That he'd worked this land 6 years and hadn't thought of widening the channel, and she had thought of it in about 90 seconds in the dark. "You've kept this place running through a hard stretch," she said, which was what she'd said to him months ago. "This is just one more hard stretch." He looked at her sideways. Something in his expression had a different quality than it ever had before. Not softened exactly, but changed in some way that wasn't reversible. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was the same 2 words he'd always said. It meant something different now. Colt came back across the dry creek bed at first light. He was on foot. He'd left the horse with Gavin to manage the scattered cattle, and he walked the eastern fence line from south to north, looking at the burned ground on the far side and the wet, intact ground on theirs. And his face as he did it was the face of a man reading a story in the landscape. He found her sitting near the main valve with the burlap sack still in her hand, which she'd forgotten to put down. He looked at the channel. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. "How many crossings?" he said. 3. All caught. She stood up, which took more effort than it should have. "Cattle?" "Most of them. Lost maybe a dozen total." He looked at the channel again. The wide section, the running water, the blackened earth on the far side of the fence that stopped cleanly at the wet line. He was quiet for a long time. "Clara?" "The southeastern corner took the worst of it," she said. "The fence posts along there are going to need replacing, some of the wire too." "Clara," he said again, with a different weight. She stopped talking and looked at him. He was not a man who expressed things easily. She knew this. He moved through the world with a kind of emotional economy that she'd come to read in its small signals. The near smile, the particular quality of his silences, the way he said things once and meant them fully and didn't repeat them. Standing in the gray first light with smoke still hanging in the cold air, He looked at her the way you looked at something that had just shown you what it was made of. And he hadn't been wrong in his estimate, but he hadn't quite known how right he was going to be. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She looked at the wet ground and the intact fence and the running channel and the smoke-dark sky lightening in the east, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not pride, which was too simple, but something in the same family. The knowledge of having done a hard thing correctly under pressure, without guidance, in the dark. "The southeastern fence needs inspection," she said. He almost laughed. It came out as a sound that wasn't quite anything, and he shook his head once, and they walked the fence line together in the early morning, stepping over burned wire and charred posts, cataloging the damage, already thinking about what would need to happen next. 10. 3 days after the fire, Sheriff Aldane rode out from Red Hollow. He was a deliberate man, Aldane, mid-50s, the kind of careful that came from watching what happened when you weren't. He'd been sheriff for 11 years and had the relationship with Silas Crow that most officials in the valley had, which was cautious and at arm's length. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and looked at the map Clara spread on the table, a hand-drawn map she'd made the morning after the fire, marking the 3 ignition points she and Decker had identified from the burn pattern. 3 points, Aldane said, separated by about 200 yards each, she said, along the southern ridge. All started within roughly the same hour, based on how the burns developed. She pointed. This one, at the western point, would have been the first. The burn pattern fans north-northeast from here, which matches the wind direction. The other 2 caught from the first and widened the front. Aldane looked at the map without touching it. Natural fire doesn't start in 3 places. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He looked up at her. "You're saying this was set?" "I'm saying the burn pattern is consistent with 3 separate ignitions, and I'd like to know what a proper investigation finds." She kept her voice even. "I'm also saying that the night of the fire, we were on the road between Marble Creek and Red Hollow. We'd been at the county records office in Marble Creek that afternoon looking at a draft boundary claim filed by Dunbar on behalf of Silas Crow. We came back to find our valley burning." Aldane was quiet for a long time. He looked at the map again, and she could see him doing what officials did when they were deciding how much they were willing to see. "I'll need to walk the ridge," he said finally. "I'll show you where," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The recalibration she'd seen on other faces, the adjustment to a version of her that didn't match the version they'd carried in. "You mapped this yourself?" "The morning after the fire. Yes." He picked up his coffee. "Who else have you told about Marble Creek?" "The county attorney's office," she said. "I sent a letter yesterday." Something moved across Aldane's face. It might have been respect. It might have been the mild discomfort of a man who preferred to be ahead of things and had just discovered he was behind. He set down his coffee. "All right," he said. "Show me the ridge." But Todd, she walked the southern ridge with Aldane that afternoon. The ridge was accessible from the east side up a rocky trail that she and Colt had ridden once in September to check the grazing on the upper plateau. On foot it was harder, the ground unstable in places where the fire had burned the root systems holding the soil. She went first, which was a practical decision. She knew where she was going, and Aldane followed without commenting on it. At the 3 ignition points she stopped and let him look. He was thorough. He crouched at each site and examined the ground and took notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket. And he didn't say much, and she stood back and waited and let him work. At the 3rd point, the easternmost one, closest to the Crow property boundary, he found something she hadn't. A piece of oil-soaked cloth, partially burned, tucked under a rock shelf where the fire had burned around it rather than through it. He held it up in the afternoon light. "Fire starter," he said. She looked at it. "Someone left it." "Dropped it, more likely. In a hurry." He wrapped it in his handkerchief. "This is evidence of intent." He said it carefully, weighing each word. "Yes," she said. "It is." He stood and looked south, toward where Crow's land began, and his expression had the particular flatness of a man who had known something for a long time and was now being asked to act on it. "Silas Crow," he said. Not a question. "That's your determination to make," she said. "I'm just showing you where to look." He looked at her sideways. "You've been doing a lot of showing people where to look." Someone has to, she said. He put the handkerchief in his jacket pocket. The wind came across the ridge, carrying the cold of the altitude and the smell of burned ground below, and the valley spread out from where they stood. The ranch, the creek lines, the pastures that were black in the east and green-brown in the west, the whole complicated, difficult piece of land that she had arrived on 8 months ago in a dress that hadn't fit and had not left. Mrs. Maddox, Aldane said. He stopped, seemed to reconsider. I've known this valley a long time. I know you have. I've watched Crow operate for 7 years. He looked at the piece of road below that ran toward Red Hollow, the same road she'd walked to her wedding. I won't pretend I didn't know the shape of what he was. I will tell you that knowing and having something to act on are different things. I understand that, she said. You've given me something to act on. She nodded. He turned back toward the trail down. I'll be making some calls to Redfield tonight. He paused. You should have copies of everything you've documented. Everything. Keep them somewhere safe. I do, she said. I have. He went down the trail. She stayed on the ridge for a moment longer, looking at the valley. Her valley, she thought, and then thought it again because it was true in a way that had nothing to do with the legal documents and everything to do with the 8 months of work and watching and the night at the channel with the wet burlap sack in the heat. Then she went down after him, because there was still a fence to repair and cattle to account for, and a ranch to keep running, and none of that was going to wait for her. The county hearing was scheduled for the second week of November, 6 weeks after the fire. Clara spent those 6 weeks doing what she did with most things that frightened her. She worked. She organized the documentation into a sequence that any county official with functional eyesight could follow. The tally book, with its dated cattle loss records. The supply ledgers showing operational continuity. Pearson's counter survey with its seal and signature, the fire investigation report that Sheriff Aldane had filed after 3 days on the burned ground, and most critically, the written statements from 4 of Crow's own former hands, men who had quietly found their way to Colt or to Hector Vale in the weeks after the fire, men who had things to say about what they'd been asked to do and had decided, for reasons of their own, that they were done carrying it. She hadn't gone looking for those men. They had come to her, which told her something about the kind of operation Crow had been running, the kind where the people doing the dirty work eventually looked at themselves in whatever surface was available and found they didn't like what they saw. The first had been a lean, weathered man named Cord, who showed up at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak to Mrs. Maddox specifically. Not Colt. Her. He sat at the kitchen table and turned his hat in his hands and told her that he'd been one of 3 men running cattle out of the southeastern pasture through the moonless nights since July, that he'd been paid in cash by a Crow foreman whose name he knew, and that the night of the fire he'd been told to stay clear of the valley, which was when he'd understood that the fire hadn't been an accident and had decided he wanted no further part of any of it. She gave him coffee. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him 3 clarifying questions, wrote down his answers, and asked if he'd be willing to sign a statement. He said yes. She didn't ask him why he'd come. Some questions were better left alone. 2 more came the following week, and a 4th the week after that. And each time she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her careful, attentive questions. And Colt stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was exactly right. These men had come to her. She understood why without being able to fully articulate it. She was not the power in the room. And sometimes people with difficult things to say needed to say them to someone who wasn't. By the time she had 4 signed statements, the shape of what Crow had done was complete and ugly on paper. The cattle theft, the planted hand, the surveyor running false lines, and the fire, set from 3 points along the southern ridge, on a night when the wind was moving northeast, directly toward the Maddox Ranch, on a night when Colt happened to be away from the property. The fire had not been designed to destroy the ranch. It had been designed to break the season, to create enough loss and chaos that the operation couldn't sustain itself through winter, triggering the water rights conditional clause, at which point Crow would file his boundary claim and his water rights petition simultaneously. It was, she thought, genuinely impressive in its construction. It was also the kind of plan that required a great many people to do a great many things they weren't proud of, and that was always its own vulnerability. She sent copies of everything to the county attorney's office in Redfield 2 weeks before the hearing. She also went to see her father. She had gone once already in the immediate aftermath of the fire to tell him about the water rights conditional clause in Crow's boundary plans. That conversation had been functional and brief. Her father absorbed information the way he did most things, quietly and without visible reaction. And then he'd said he would look into it, and she'd said thank you and left. This time was different. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and her mother was in the kitchen, and her father was at his desk with his accounts, which was where he always was in the afternoon, and she sat in the chair across from him that she had sat in since she was a child, being lectured about one thing or another. "I need you to testify at the county hearing," she said, "about the original property arrangement, your understanding of the water rights agreement, the terms, the intent." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "The county attorney doesn't need me." "No," she said, "but I do." She held his gaze. Crow's legal argument depends partly on the framing of the original arrangement, suggesting it was irregular, rushed, made under pressure. If you testify to the legitimate terms and the legitimate intent, it closes that angle. He set down his pen. "You've thought this through." "I've thought everything through," she said. "I've been thinking everything through since July." He was quiet. Her father's silences were different from Colt's, denser, more weighted with things he'd decided not to say. She'd grown up translating them. "You've done well out there," he said finally. It was the most he'd ever said along those lines. She felt the pull of it, the old hunger to lean into it, to let it mean what she'd always wanted it to mean. She sat straight instead. "I know," she said. "Will you testify?" "Yes," he said. "I'll testify." Her mother appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, the way she always materialized at moments of tension with something practical. Clara took the cup and drank it and looked at the room she'd grown up in, the familiar angles of it, the window that looked onto the main street of Red Hollow, where she'd walked to her own wedding in a dress that hadn't fit. She thought about the woman who had walked that road, who had sat in a church and listened to people muffle their laughter, who had stood in the sun after with a cup of spiked lemonade and looked at the mountains because they were the only thing in her immediate field of vision that wasn't cruel. She was still that woman. She hadn't been transformed into someone else by the last 4 months, but she had been added to. The tally book, the ledgers, the kitchen negotiations, the canyon road to Marble Creek, the night of the fire. It was all part of the same person. The girl they'd written off had simply kept going until she'd become something they hadn't planned for. She drank her coffee and didn't say any of that. "Thank you, Papa," she said. The county hearing was held in the Redfield Courthouse, a room that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular mustiness of official proceedings. It was not a trial, county hearings rarely were, but it had the weight of one, because everyone in that room understood that what happened here would determine what happened next. Crow was there with Dunbar beside him. He looked exactly as she'd imagined, broad, well-dressed, with the stillness of a man who had walked into this room expecting to win it. He glanced at Clara when she came in, and his expression did something small and controlled that she filed away. He had not expected her to be here. He had expected Colt. That was interesting. The county official who ran the hearing was a woman in her 50s named Hargrove, with steel gray hair and the manner of someone who had heard every version of every land dispute in 3 counties and was no longer susceptible to theater. Clara appreciated her immediately. Dunbar went first. He laid out Crow's boundary claim with the polished efficiency of a man who'd done this many times. The surveying dispute, the 1871 land grant language, the argued 40-acre discrepancy. He was good. The argument was technically sound on its surface, and she could see Hargrove making notes with the careful attention of someone genuinely weighing it. Then the county attorney presented the response. Pearson's counter-survey went in first. Then the operational records, the tally book, the supply ledgers, the documented water usage from the Lower Creek Bend. Then the fire investigation report, with its 3 ignition points and its northeast wind pattern and its timestamp. Then the 4 signed statements. The room changed when the statements went in. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no moment of cinematic revelation. It was quieter than that. Hargrove read each statement without expression, but her pen stopped moving, which was its own kind of signal. Dunbar objected to the statements as hearsay. The county attorney argued that signed, sworn statements from named individuals with direct knowledge were not hearsay under territorial evidence rules. Hargrove considered it for 45 seconds and overruled the objection. Clara's father testified for 12 minutes, clearly and without embellishment. He described the water rights arrangement in plain language, its purpose, its terms, the legitimate legal process by which it had been filed. He was not a demonstrative man, but he was a precise one, and precision was what the moment needed. When he finished, he looked at Clara briefly before sitting down. She gave him a small nod. Crow's attorney called Crow to speak. He was measured, confident, the performance of a man who had done nothing wrong. He acknowledged the boundary dispute as a good faith interpretation. He denied any knowledge of the fire's origin. He described his interest in the Maddox water rights as a legitimate business matter pursued through legal channels. He was convincing. She could feel him being convincing in the room. Then the county attorney asked him about Cord, by name. The confidence didn't break. It adjusted, which was almost more revealing. A subtle recalibration behind the eyes. He said he didn't recognize the name. The county attorney read from Cord's statement, slowly, specific details about specific nights, specific amounts of cash, specific instructions from a specific Crow foreman. Crow said he had no knowledge of his foreman's activities in those particulars. Hargrove looked at him over her papers and said, "Mr. Crow, are you aware that 2 of the other individuals named in these statements have also provided sworn testimony to the county sheriff's office in the last 10 days? Clara had not known that. She kept her face still. Crow's attorney leaned in and said something quietly. Crow said he would need to consult with counsel. Hargrove said he would have that opportunity. She also said that given the fire investigation report and the convergent testimony, she was suspending the boundary claim review pending a formal criminal inquiry, and that the water rights conditional clause question was likewise suspended pending resolution of the inquiry. She said it in about 4 sentences, flat and final, the way you said something when you'd made up your mind and weren't interested in debate. Dunbar gathered his papers. Crow stood and buttoned his jacket with the deliberate composure of a man refusing to let his face show what his body knew. He walked out without looking at Clara. At the door, he paused. He turned, and across the room he looked at her directly for the first time. It was a long look, and she held it without flinching. And then he walked out. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 4 months. The criminal inquiry took until January. In the end, Crow was not charged with arson. The evidence was strong but not airtight, the kind of case that prosecutors in small territories were reluctant to take to full trial without a direct witness to the ignition. What he was charged with was cattle theft, conspiracy to commit fraud in the boundary survey filing, and suborning perjury in the water rights complaint. These were not small charges. He settled. His lawyers negotiated it the way powerful men's lawyers always did, quietly, with money changing hands in the form of restitution, and Crow himself relocating his primary operation to a county 200 miles north by spring. The Maddox Ranch kept its water rights. The boundary claim was formally dismissed. The southeastern fence line stayed where it had always been. Clara recorded all of this in her notebook on a Friday in February, sitting at the kitchen table in the particular winter light that came through the south window in the afternoon. Low and gold and specific, the kind of light you remembered. She wrote the dates, the outcomes, the final numbers. Then she closed the notebook and sat for a while with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cool. It was not triumph, exactly. She had been in enough difficulty in her life to know that resolution wasn't the same thing as triumph. Triumph was a feeling that burned hot and then cooled, and what was left after it cooled was just the place you actually lived. What she felt was more like settlement, like something that had been held in suspension had finally been allowed to rest. Spring came late to the valley, the way it did in drought years. Tentative, unconvincing, then suddenly committed. The creek came back first, both bends running strong from snowmelt, and she walked the line of it in the first warm week of March, and stood at the lower bend and felt the cold off the water, and thought about Decker's face when she'd first mentioned it. The careful skepticism of a man who'd been on this land 6 years and hadn't considered it. The ranch was not transformed. That was the honest version, and she had committed herself to honest versions. The drought had taken a real toll, and rebuilding a herd took time and money they were still careful with. 2 of the ranch hands had left over the winter, one to his family in another county, one for reasons he didn't explain, and she and Colt had agreed not to replace them immediately. to operate lean through spring and see what the season looked like before adding payroll. Decker was still there. He had become, in the way of things that happened gradually and without ceremony, something like an ally. He didn't say much more to her than he ever had, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was working silence now rather than dismissive silence, the kind that meant you were both thinking about the same problem rather than pretending the other person wasn't in the room. The town was different too, not transformed. She had no patience for the version of this story where a community underwent a moral awakening and everyone who'd been unkind became a better person overnight. That wasn't how people worked. What happened was smaller and more real, the particular discomfort of Red Hollow having been wrong about something in a way that was now difficult to ignore. Henry Walsh stopped her on the street in March and talked to her about the spring cattle market for 6 minutes, which was the longest conversation they'd ever had and which he conducted with the slightly overcompensating attentiveness of a man who knew he'd been rude and was trying to balance an account. She was civil and informative and did not remind him of the wedding reception because there was nothing to gain from it. Doris Hatch was harder. Doris was the kind of person who dealt with being wrong by simply never acknowledging it, moving forward as if the past had been edited. Clara found she could live with that. Forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and she hadn't forgotten, but she also wasn't interested in carrying it everywhere she went. Edmund Bauer told 3 separate customers over the winter about Mrs. Maddox's trading sense, which she heard about through Hector Vale, who told her with the small, satisfied expression of someone who'd been on the right side of something. The thing about respect, she had decided, was that it was less interesting than she'd thought it would be. When she was younger and the town's opinion had pressed on her from all sides, she had imagined that being respected would feel like being finally admitted to a room she'd been standing outside. It didn't feel like that. It felt like the room she'd been in all along had gotten quieter, and people had started listening to what she said. That was something. It was just not the transformation she'd pictured. On a Saturday in late April, Colt came in from the pasture in the early evening and found her at the kitchen table with the spring supply order spread out in front of her. He washed up at the basin and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, which was something he did now without thinking about it. The ease of a habit that had formed without either of them deciding to form it. "Pearson stopped by," he said. She looked up. "What did he want?" "The Harmon family over on the Flat Creek side wants a property survey. He's doing the work next month, and he asked if you'd be willing to consult on the filing documentation." Colt drank his coffee. "He said, and I'm quoting here, that you had a better head for county filing language than anyone he'd worked with." She looked at him. "He's paying," Colt said. She looked back at the supply order. "How much?" "Enough to cover the feed costs for May." She considered it. "Tell him yes." Colt nodded. Then he said, "There's something else." She waited. 3 ranchers from the North Valley want to meet. Next week, if you're willing. They've been watching what happened here, the Crow situation, how it was handled, and they want to talk about organizing some kind of cooperative agreement, shared legal resources, coordinated record keeping, that kind of thing. He set down his cup. "They asked for you specifically." She sat with that for a moment. "They asked for me," she said. "By name." She thought about a chalkboard outside a saloon and odds written in chalk and a town that had come to a wedding to watch something fail. She thought about a dress that didn't fit and a porch where she'd drunk spiked lemonade in the unforgiving sun and held herself very still so nothing would show on her face. She thought about the tally book, the ledgers, the canyon road, the fire, the smell of smoke on a cold night, and the decision she had made in about 3 seconds. That was the right decision, even though she hadn't known that yet. "All right," she said. "Next week." Colt looked at her with the expression she'd learned over 8 months, the one that wasn't a smile, but contained everything a smile would have said. He picked up his coffee. "You know," he said, "when Walsh made that arrangement with my family, I didn't know what I was getting." "Neither did I," she said. "I mean that the other way," he said. "I didn't know what I was getting, as in, I didn't know it would be this." She put down her pen and looked at him directly. "This being what? You handling a county hearing, you talking 4 men into signing statements, you knowing about the Lower Creek bend before anyone else thought to look." He paused, turning the coffee cup in his hands. You running a ranch better than I was running it alone. You were running it fine, she said. You were just running it without enough eyes. I had eyes, he said. I didn't have yours. It was the most he'd ever said along those lines, and he said it the way he said most important things, without ceremony, as if it were simply true and he was simply reporting it. She felt it land somewhere it needed to land, the specific spot she'd been protecting for 24 years by convincing herself she didn't need anyone to say it. She picked her pen back up. The May feed order needs to go to Bauer by Thursday, she said, or the price goes up. Thursday, he said, and the southeastern fence needs another inspection before spring. I want to walk it myself. I'll go with you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He stood, picked up his cup. I want to. She wrote down Thursday, Bauer in the margin of the supply order, and didn't say anything else because she didn't need to. 2. They walked the southeastern fence on a Tuesday morning when the air still had winter in it, but the light was fully spring. That particular contradiction that April made, cold and bright at once, the kind of day that felt like an argument the seasons were having that hadn't been settled yet. The fence was intact. All of it. She walked the full half-mile along the line where the Maddox property met what had been Crow's scrubland, now under different management, a quiet family from the east who'd bought it at a reduced price and seemed to have no ambitions beyond running a few sheep and being left alone. She checked each post, each wire, each corner anchor, and Colt walked beside her without comment, and there was nothing wrong with any of it. At the southeastern corner, the one she'd counted past in the dark with her tally book, the one the surveyors had walked in the moonless nights, the one that Crow had built his 40-acre claim around. She stopped. She put her hand on the corner post. It was solid. The cedar was grayed and weathered, the wire tight, the anchor sunk deep in the dry ground. It had been here before Crow decided he wanted what was on the other side of it, and it was here now, and it would be here next year. Colt stood a few feet off, looking south toward the distant mountains, which were still white at their tops and would be for another month. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it's a good fence," she said. He looked at it. "It is." She took her hand off the post and turned back toward the ranch, which was visible from here as a cluster of dark timber against the pale spring grass. Small from this distance, the way most things that mattered looked small from the outside. She had not won a war. She had not triumphed over a town or redeemed herself in the eyes of people who'd written her off. Those were the versions of this story that got told in a certain register, with a certain music under them, and they weren't quite right. What had actually happened was this. A woman had arrived somewhere, found it in difficulty, and done the work that was in front of her. She had used what she was good at, the numbers, the patience, the watching. And she had done it without asking whether anyone was going to give her credit for it, because asking that question first was how you got paralyzed. The credit had come eventually in the small irregular way that credit usually did. Not as a ceremony, not as a pronouncement, but as 3 ranchers in the North Valley asking for her by name, and Edmund Bauer telling his customers about her trading sense, and Decker saying you were right about the lower bend with his hat in his hands. She thought about all the women she had known in Red Hollow who were smart and competent and careful, who had spent their whole lives managing the gap between what they were and what the town was willing to see. She didn't know what to do with that thought except hold it. She couldn't fix it for anyone else. She could only do what she'd done. Keep going, keep watching, do the work that needed doing, and refuse to disappear. That was not a lesson with clean edges. It was not the kind of thing you wrote on a sampler and hung on a wall. It was just the truth of how things moved, slowly and with friction, in a world that didn't reorganize itself for your benefit. You reorganized yourself for the world. And then, if you were patient and precise and lucky, the world reorganized a little in return. The spring grass moved in the wind. The mountains held their white. The fence ran straight and solid from corner post to corner post across a ground that was hers, that was theirs, that was not going anywhere. She walked home.